And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again, I have this intense storm now pulling north of the central Aleutians there with gale, storm, and at least an area of hurricane force winds right through here, south sides of Adak and Atka. And the front pushing storm force winds, good storm force winds into eastern Aleutians, and wind and rain on the increase for the Pribilofs. Windy conditions continue tomorrow. Low starts to weaken and doesn't get too much farther north than this. Nice conditions here in the west-southwest part of the state. Actually, all of interior Alaska looking pretty good. A few lingering snow showers in the Arctic coast. And then this system down here tonight pulls northward. High wind watch out for the central coast of the Panhandle tomorrow for winds gusting possibly 60 miles an hour with rain heavy at times for the remainder of the area there, pulling westward again, increasing moisture. Likes to pull westward here lately into Prince William Sound, but not before tomorrow evening. And nice over the interior. And then for the day on Friday, not bad over the interior here. And then that moisture kind of retreats back to the west as that whole system washes out here. And then this system, a new low develops, but not nearly as strong as a parent low here, which is weakening as it gets ready to, or it actually starts moving south and southeastward there. So very strong winds from about Adak back to Amchitka Island. And for the coastal water forecast, gales on the south coast for southeast winds 35 to 40 knots tomorrow, seas around 20 feet. East 35 knots for the central coast, and the north coast east winds 25 knots with 8 to 10 foot seas. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, north winds 30 knots with gusts of 45 knots, southeast at 25 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, southeast winds at 30 knots. And for Friday, Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, northeast at 25. Southeast winds 20 to 35 knots for Clarence Strait, or for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, southeast at 20. And 25 knot south winds on the south coast, east 20 to 25 knots for the north coast, or for the central coast here. North coast pretty light now, east to southeast at 15. Prince William Sound, east winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. Cook Inlet, north 15 to 20, 20 to 25 knots for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, North Gulf Coast, east to northeast, 20 to 25 knots. And for Friday, Prince William Sound, east winds 20 knots, east-southeast at 20 for the eastern North Gulf Coast, west side here, southeast at 15. Small craft advisories, Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, east to southeast winds at 25, and variable winds 10 to 15 knots for Cook Inlet. And there we go, Kodiak Island, variable to north winds 20 knots for the day Thursday. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. And then much lighter on Friday with now that front weakening to the point where you just have small craft advisories for Bristol Bay at 25 knots there. Otherwise, variable winds 10 to 20 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Eastern Aleutians, southeast 45 knots tomorrow. Storm warnings tomorrow for the central Aleutians. West-southwest 55 knots with gusts to 70 knots. Seas here 22 to 37 feet. And then west winds at 55 to 60 knots, gusts 70 knots for Amchitka Island, falling back to 45 knots for the Shimei-Atu area to Kiska. And then for Friday, west of Adak, west-northwest winds 45 knots, Adak and Atka west at 45 knots, and the eastern Aleutians, specifically on Alaska Island, south to southwest 15 to 20. For the southwest coast tomorrow, east winds at 20 knots, east winds 15 knots, St. Lawrence Island. And storm warnings for the Pribilofs, east sustained at 50 knots, seas a shade over 20 feet, east 40 knots with 21-foot seas for St. Matthew Island. And for the day on Friday, gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, northeast 35 knots, seas 20 feet, east at 30 there for the Pribilofs, southwest coast, northeast at 20, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, also looking at northeast winds at 20 knots. Chukchi for tomorrow, east winds 10 to 15 knots. Western Arctic coast, east at 15, southeast 15 for the west side. Light winds for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And then those pick up east-northeast again, 25 knots. Small craft advisories for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Otherwise, central and western Arctic coast, winds northeast at 20 knots.